Before we begin, I want to offer you a moment to check in with yourself. This episode we're going to cover some emotional distancing, disconnection, and manipulation. And if you're like in this tender place right now, if your body feels even off center slightly, you don't have to push through this. Take a pause, take a breath, and then come back when you're ready. Because your wellness matters far more than your momentum. And there's no shame in honoring your nervous system, ever. And if you're still here, if you're ready to walk with me into this next chapter, well, let's begin then. Most likely you didn't just drift away. You were moved little by little, one conversation at a time, one emotional cue at a time, until you looked up one day and then realized that the people who used to help you feel grounded or clear or real were no longer close anymore. And maybe it didn't feel violent, maybe it didn't even feel like intentional at first, but the result was still the same. And that is, you ended up emotionally alone. And not by accident. See, that's the most disorienting part about this, of manipulative dynamics at least. And that is that the isolation that you feel, it doesn't always come from locked doors or raised voices. No, it comes from persuasion or suggestions or emotional nudges, innocent sounding observations that slowly reframe your world and the way you see it. See, you didn't get isolated because you were difficult. You didn't get isolated, like, you didn't get isolated just because you outgrew the people, as much as you got isolated because it made you easier to manage, easier to shape, easier to influence, easier to control. Because connection is protection, isn't it? And they knew that. So they cut you off. They did so quietly, strategically, and then called it love. When people talk about abuse, they often focus on the behavior, the yelling, the name calling, the gaslighting. But some of the most effective manipulation, I think, happens in what's not said, what's not questioned, what's not challenged. Because if someone can get you alone, like emotionally or mentally or even spiritually, they don't really have to dominate you. They just have to become your only reference point. And once that happens, they don't even have to be loud. You'll silence yourself. And this is what grooming movements like the 764 understand so deeply. They don't always isolate you by force. No, they isolate you by validation, by comfort, by telling you exactly what you wish someone had said to you years ago. And in doing so, they pull you into this world. Their logic, their version of what safety looks like, their definition of healing. And to protect this new world, they quietly convince you that everything else is a threat. Your old friends, well, they're just naive. Your therapist is biased, right? Your family is too emotional. And your old self, well, he's just weak, unawakened, or maybe even controlled. And in this reframed world, they become the only people who see the truth. And so when you start to feel uneasy or unsure, well, you have no one else to check in with then, right? No one who remembers who you were before. No one who can say, hey, something's off here. Because those people, well, they were gently pushed out of your orbit months ago. And it didn't look like sabotage. It looked like growth. right? It looked like leveling up. It looked like new awareness. It looked like finally finding your people. But growth that isolates you from those who love you is not growth. That's what grooming is. That kind of separation is strategic because control doesn't just require access to you. Control requires exclusive access. And if they can't remove your agency, then they'll remove your reflections. And without reflection, you'll start to doubt yourself. You'll second guess your memory. You'll start interpreting everything through this lens that they gave you. And they don't even need to silence your voice. They just need to make sure you only speak in rooms where they're the ones holding the mic. This is how isolation becomes a tactic. It starts small, it starts subtle, and they suggest someone in your life isn't really safe, right? They hint that your connections are based more in codependence. They mock people that you love, and just enough to plant that seed of doubt. And they ask why you still talk to someone who doesn't really understand or get you. And because it's framed as care, you're likely to let it slide. And so you start pulling back. Not because you wanted to, but because now you're afraid not to. You're afraid that if you open up to the wrong person, then you're going to regress. You're afraid that if you let too many voices in, you're going to lose your clarity. You're afraid that if you reconnect with certain people, well, then you'll lose your progress. And that fear wasn't planted by your body. It was really planted by them. Because if they can isolate you, they can start defining you. And if they define you, they control now how you see yourself. It's not that you changed overnight, though. It's that your context was, in essence, rewritten. And in a new context, now everything feels uncertain. And that uncertainty keeps you close. Not out of loyalty as much, but out of need. Because you, like, the lonelier that you feel, the more that you crave their approval. And that approval becomes like a drug, a hit, a fix that says, you're still good, you're still loved, you're still in. And the withdrawal, though, the withdrawal feels so much like death. This is how you become emotionally dependent on people who never truly saw you. They didn't meet you with unconditional love, right? They met you instead with conditional affirmation. And once you were hooked, they started tightening that leash. And the leash looked like compliments. The leash looked like support. The leash looked like just us against the world. But the world was not attacking you. They were, in essence, cutting you off from the world. And the worst part is you participated in your own disconnection. Not because you were foolish, more so because you were slowly convinced that it was your idea. That's, I think, the genius of manipulation. It makes you believe that leaving safety behind was your decision. But here's the truth, though. You never would have walked away from what made you feel unseen, unless someone reframed it as dangerous. And now that you see it, now that you're waking up to what happened, you might feel embarrassed. You might feel ashamed. You might feel like you can't trust your own judgments. what you call naivete was actually loyalty. What you call weakness was most likely a longing. What you were calling foolishness was most likely hope. You wanted to believe that people who got you wouldn't use that access to isolate you. That someone who offered care would not cut you off from community. And that the ones who called you family wouldn't silence your actual voice. That, my dear listener, is not something to be ashamed of. That's I think something to grieve. Because you deserved better than a counterfeit kind of safety. You deserve belonging that didn't come at the cost of your clarity. You deserved a community that didn't require your conformity. And now that you're seeing it for what it is, I think you get to choose again. You get to begin reconnecting, even if it's slow, even if it's awkward, even if it's done imperfectly. You get to send the message or make that call to revisit the friend that you pulled away from, or to tell the truth that you were once afraid to say. You get to ask someone, hey, can we talk? I've been feeling really isolated and alone this last little while. And that moment, as small as it might seem, that's the moment of resistance. Because connection is how we break isolation. And reconnection is how we reclaim ourselves. You don't have to make a grand exit. You don't have to burn everything down to the ground. You don't even have to call. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to say, the silence doesn't make me feel like me anymore. And when you're able to do that, I think you'll be shocked at how quickly your inner compass starts working again. Because clarity hasn't gone. It was just covered over for a season. Covered by the conditioning, and covered by the guilt, and by fear, and covered by the echo of a voice that told you that everyone else was the enemy. But the enemy was never really outside. The enemy was really the belief that you weren't allowed to be known anymore by anyone. And that can end now. See, you are allowed to reconnect. You're allowed to rebuild. You're allowed to relearn trust and to find new mirrors to peer into. To reassemble yourself and your sense of self piece by piece. You don't have to stay loyal to your isolation just because someone framed that as the most effective means of protection. You're allowed to question the silence. You're allowed to walk toward a community that actually sees you. And when you do, you'll start to remember perhaps who you were before the control dressed itself up as care. Before connection was used as a cage. Before the disconnection was even marketed as strength. You're not alone, my dear listener. You're not too far gone. You're not broken. I think you could be in the midst of waking up. And that's a beautiful and holy thing, I think. Listen, if this episode named something that you've felt but never had the words for, come back tomorrow. Tomorrow's episode is called the Trap of Belonging. And in this episode, I'm going to be unpacking how manipulators don't just isolate you, but they in essence replace your disconnection with this counterfeit version of closeness, a belonging that binds instead of frees you. So you won't want to miss tomorrow's episode. But until then, keep choosing connection that honors your voice. Keep noticing where you feel small. Okay? and keep walking toward those spaces where you can be whole. And do remember, if they had to cut you off from love to call it care, it was never really love at all in the first place. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you tomorrow.